Right, we're live. So, hello everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to introduce my old friend Rachael Mackenzie to start with. So, she is not a horsey. We met many years ago. I was trying to remember how long ago it is. 15, 20 years
Must
ago.
be. Yeah, I reckon.
When I was a student physio and she was my supervisor when I was on placement in Bradford. And we've stayed friends ever since, haven't we?
Yeah.
And Rachael is, I've got a note here, a world Thaiboxing champion. And you became the first European woman to compete in a traditional bare-knuckle fight in Thailand.
I know. I always find that a bit when I tell my patients what I do as a sport, bearing in mind my speciality is neuro, so brain injury. They're always horrified by the thought that I voluntarily go and get punched in the head.
Something that I'm definitely going to ask you about later. And then I'm not going to spoil much more of the rest of the story because you're going to tell us it. But as I say, you're not horsey, but I think that some of the things that we're going to talk about hopefully are going to one of the aims of this podcast is to help people believe in themselves and that sort of side of our sport. So hopefully you'll have some inspiration and some motivation for us all. So do you want to start off by just telling us a bit about yourself and how you got into boxing?
Well, by accident, really. So I started Thaiboxing when I was at uni doing my physio degree. My housemate basically made me go with her. And it's quite a long time ago. So the 90s, late 90s, how old I am, the sport wasn't evolved to really support women. There weren't other girls competing. Even, we went around a couple of clubs, but there weren't girls there. And the attitude was still very much about this is a boys' sport. We don't have girls, and you're not welcome. And I think that probably that kind of early start in the sport really was what motivated me in terms of competing, because I didn't have any intention. I didn't sit at home one day thinking, oh, I know what I'd love to do with my life. I'd love to go and get punched. There was no big drive or desire to be an athlete. I had being a physio very much as my career path and plan, and what I'd intended to do from being quite young. So it was just about going with a friend and finding ourselves in a position where we weren't welcome. We were made to feel not welcome. And I was coming out the back of some mental health problems and eating disorder. And actually, what I found was that hitting the bag just made me feel better, and it still does now. I go in the gym and I get the same feeling that I got when I first started hitting and having that contact. That physicality was really, it kind of brought me alive, I suppose.
Yeah. So tell us a bit about the first time you went to the club then and the reaction of the coach.
Well, I can still remember there was a guy in the club called Monkey, and I don't know why he was a bit like a monkey. He was really just not that bright, and he just sort of lumbered around the place. But him and all of the sort of main fighters in there really were very much with the coach. When we got there, we were literally told, you can't come here. We don't have girls. You need to leave. And that was it. And I suppose we went back really because even then, and at the time, there weren't any female role models in sport. There weren't really any female role models in any positions of power. But at the time, it felt just so wrong that we were being told that we couldn't do something just because we were a girl. So I suppose we really just kept going to annoy the coach and all the lads that were in the gym. It was.
So I can't actually believe you kept going back when you've been told to leave because you're a girl. So I want to know a bit more about that. What was it? Well, you've told me a bit about the motivation to go back just to annoy him. But so did you perceive it as a rejection or as a challenge? Because I think a lot of people are afraid of reaching out to other people for help, particularly like with horses, and when you're struggling, you might be afraid to reach out to somebody that's you feel is better than you, but you need some help. What would you say to people in that position?
Well, I think probably in the mind of the coaches that I can, and still coaches that I come across now, you know, I don't look like what people perceive a boxer to look like in their minds. And if you know, line up a load of kids and ask them to pick out the boxer, that they would never pick me, as would no other rational adult probably, because I don't look like that image that people have of a boxer.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that part of what the coaches were trying to do, and when I can reflect on it in a more emotionally mature way, was really just to make sure that I was stable enough to get in the ring and deal with that conflict, that contact,
Right.
because it's a brutal sport, isn't it? Now, you know, I am probably being a little bit generous in their motivations, but I do think that part of that challenge was about making sure I had the capacity to cope with being, you know, being punched, being challenged, being in that kind of fight, that brutal space.
Yeah, just testing you a little bit.
Yeah, testing me a little bit. You know, some of the coaches, definitely it's about that misogyny and not believing that women should take part. And that still happens now. This afternoon, I read an article from one of the guys that heads up the UFC who doesn't think women should compete in the UFC because he doesn't like to see women hitting each other. You know, and there is still that underlying conversation across a lot of sports. You know,
Yeah.
It's not just in boxing, it's pervasive across a whole range of sports.
Yeah.
But to your point about asking for help, everything that I've achieved has been because I'm part of a team. You know, even in those early days when I wasn't winning, you know, I managed to pick up a few coaches who were emotionally very supportive and who were encouraging and who kind of, you know, gently nudged me along. But I also picked up random strangers in the supermarket or places like that would help me. You know, my first nutritionist was a guy that I overheard talking to an old lady in a supermarket, and I literally tapped him on the back and said, "I think you could help me."
Oh,
You know, and it is frightening to ask for help, isn't it? It is frightening to put yourself out there to be rejected.
yeah.
And we don't want to feel rejected. We don't want to have that sense of, you know, not being good enough for somebody else to want to help us. But actually, the more you do it, rejection just becomes part of that kind of norm, that fear. It's relieved of fear because you accept that it isn't about you. It's about the other person not having capacity to help you, or not having the skill set to help you, or perhaps not having the empathy to help you. You know,
so what did the guy in the supermarket say then?
Yeah.
Did he go, okay?
Yeah. Well, he did look at me a little bit weirdly and try and sidle off, but actually he ended up being my first nutritionist, you know, and he did it for free. I wasn't being paid very much as a fighter at the time, and he did it for free, and he would send me all my diet plans and he'd check in with me, and he'd probably helped me out for about 5 years. Yeah, but it was just about being maybe brave or stupid enough to literally tap him on the shoulder and say, "I've heard what your conversation is. I need some help. Can you help me?"
Brilliant. Cool.
Yeah.
So my number 3 question, I suppose, is a biggie actually. Looking at it, what's your relationship with fear? So I've spent the last 30 years being scared of horses, scared of quite a lot of things in my life, really. You know me well, you know what I'm like. So what's your relationship with fear? Are you afraid of getting hit, and how do you deal with that?
I think being hit teaches you not to be afraid, because actually being hurt, being physically hurt or emotionally hurt, is the thing that most people are afraid of. When we drill down into what is underneath that fear, whatever that fear is, whether it's a fear of spiders or whether it's, you know, a fear of falling off a horse, or whatever that fear is, underneath that is that fear of hurt, emotional or physical hurt. And once you've stood facing somebody who is actively trying to hurt you, then fear becomes no longer an issue, because you recognize that you can take that fear. You know, once you've been punched in the face a few times and you realize actually it doesn't hurt that much, it doesn't hurt as much as you perceive it's going to hurt, then actually hurt in general, whether that's emotional rejection or, you know, getting up and standing in front of people and talking and being afraid of being laughed at, all of those things that most people inherently are afraid of become less of a problem, because you've already taught yourself that the thing that's most frightening, pain or hurt, actually isn't as bad as you'd expect it to be.
So tell us about bare knuckle fighting then. Tell us more about that.
Well, the rules in bare knuckle fighting are actually pretty brutal. So the only way you can win is by knockout. So ultimately, you're trying to inflict quite significant damage on your opponent. And if you don't knock your opponent out, you don't get paid. You know, it's a professional sport. You don't get paid. So you're potentially flown all the way across to the other side of the world to not get paid anything because you haven't won the fight. I mean, the bare knuckle fight was actually on my honeymoon, and about.
I remember you telling me this. This is like, when I talk about you, I'm like, oh, you know my friend Rachel who went to Thailand on a honeymoon for a bare knuckle fight.
It was all, the whole year was planned, so the wedding had to be in a bit earlier before the fight, so I had enough time to train, ready to go and bare knuckle fight. But I broke my foot the week before. I was supposed to fly out there. I just took a bit of a dodgy block on my foot and broke my foot. And you know, we built this fight up to be actually part of that movement for women. You know, it was not only the first time a Western female had fought, it was the first time a female was going to fight on this big King's birthday show, fighting the national champion. It was a massive deal for women. And you know, my coach, Master A, and I had this conversation about my broken foot. And we knew we had loads of press stuff to do when we got there. So every day we'd just tape both feet as tight as we could so that nobody could tell the difference between the 2 feet. And, you know, you just went out with that mentality of, I can't allow myself to feel that pain. I can't allow myself to feel that pain. Not because I was concerned about winning the fight. You know, I've never really been concerned about winning or losing the fight. What I was concerned about was letting the girl down, but really just it felt like I was going to be letting all girls down if I didn't get in and do it. You know, it'd be like, oh, the girls have pulled out at the last minute, you know. But I didn't go into that fight with any different mentality, despite the fact that I knew knockout was the aim. I didn't go in with any different mentality. It was just another fight.
And did you knock her out?
Yeah. Yeah. And actually, I did feel a bit bad about that. I've knocked a few people out, and generally, you know, they've been all right. The doctor gets them up. You know, you're concerned because obviously they're a little bit hurt, but I don't feel really bad about it usually because you know, it's a game. You're both trying to do the same thing. But I did genuinely feel quite bad about that one because I knew that in terms of her economics, not winning that fight was a massive deal. Mm. So that's probably the only time I felt bad winning a fight, I think.
Oh. Stu's just sent us a question via Facebook. He's in the bath, right? So I'm just going to read it. So he says, he can't imagine what it feels like before you go into the ring knowing that you're going to be hit. How does boxing help you face your inner demons? And do you have to confront them, or is it something that you just get used to? I mean, I suppose we've talked about that, but how does it help you face your inner demons?
Yeah, it's about that self-talk, isn't it? So the early fights I had, and I lost a lot of my early fights, and those early fights, my self-talk was all about not being good enough. You know, I was put in the ring against people who were already champions, and I'd be looking at them thinking, oh, I'm fighting the British champion. What am I going to do? She's going to be amazing. This is going to be awful. People are going to laugh at me. I'm going to get knocked out. And I'd be having this running conversation with myself that basically told me I was going to lose. So I'd almost given myself a get out of jail free card before I got inside the ring because I'd made it all right to lose. You know, my brain was looking for a loss because that's what I'd made it expect. Mm. I was convincing myself and conditioning myself to lose because my conversation was all about how bad I was and how I wasn't strong enough and how I wasn't good enough. And I think once I noticed that, and I can clearly remember the fight where I noticed that was happening, and I remember standing in the ring, I was losing the fight, the room was chanting my opponent's name, and I could hear, my coach hadn't come with me for this fight, which was why I was just talking to myself in my head. But I could hear my self-talk being all about, oh, you're so rubbish, you're so bad. And standing there and thinking, what are you doing? You don't need anybody else you don't need to tell yourself you're not good enough.
Yeah.
Enough people say it. But what we tell ourselves becomes our reality because our brain then goes to seek that fact. You know, it goes to try and convince us that what we're telling ourselves is true.
I think it's something that a few people have mentioned on the podcast about how, you shouldn't try and compare yourself to other people, but so many of us do. And we've talked about social media and the impact of that. And, everybody puts their best bits on social media. I mean, I think everybody, whether they admit it or not, struggles with that doubt, that self-talk, that comparing yourself to other people. Like, literally, how do you stop? It's all right, it's making a decision to stop, and then you suddenly find yourself doing it again. Like, have you got any tips?
Well, it goes to that, it goes to that neuroplasticity, doesn't it? What are we reinforcing? So it is hard, but the more that you break that pattern and reinforce it with a different pattern of behavior, the less frequent it happens and the more automatic it becomes. I genuinely almost never now fall into that negative self-talk. There's not a lot that would trigger me, and I think probably even 5 or so years ago I'd have been triggered by seeing somebody doing amazing things on Instagram, or looking really great, or somebody showing their belts off. Lots of things would have triggered me, but now I suppose because I'm happy about the way that I think and feel about myself, but also because I've recognized that pattern. So I recognized it enough to question what was underlying it, and I think that almost looking at somebody and wanting to be like them tells you a little bit about what you feel like you're missing in yourself, or when you're envious of somebody else, or even when you're angry about what somebody else is doing. It's kind of that little underlying, what is it that's telling me about myself? And then how can you kind of challenge that and reframe that? If you're telling yourself you're not good enough, is that really the truth? Or is it just that there's something that you can work on that's a little bit different? Is it just a habit, a pattern of behavior, a habit? Is it a skill? But it's probably not the truth. It's probably just something that you project into yourself.
So when you had that moment of realization then in that fight, and you sort of said, right, I'm going to change this self-talk, what happened after that?
Well, I knocked my opponent out about 10 seconds into the next round. But actually it was at that point, it was about giving up caring so much what other people thought. So from that point, it was very much, I went from being connected and tied to how other people's perception of me impacted on the way I felt, to notice and what I was projecting on myself. And it wasn't like an overnight, bam, brilliant, now I feel so happy and I think I'm amazing. It was years of practice, but it was almost an instant, actually, other people's perception of me doesn't have an impact on me and the way that I perform and the person that I am. And I think because I didn't care if I won. I actually, I never cared about winning. I never cared about having a big shiny belt. I don't even know where they are, most of them. That's never been important really to me. It's more been about feeling like I've been successful for myself, like I've done my best.
And feeling like you're progressing. And in reality, most people are so wrapped up in themselves that they're not actually thinking about you anyway, are they?
They're not, no. And if they are thinking about you, it's because they need to deal with something that's underneath their issue of insecurity. If people are angered or concerned or irritated by my success or the way that I train or present myself, it's probably because it's saying something to the way they feel about themselves. And I think
I've got another question from the bath.
Okay.
Stu again, he says, is there an in the ring Rachel and a home Rachel, or does the mental toughness carry through?
I think I'm pretty steady away. I don't get mad in the ring.
You knock your kids out as well.
Well, I always like to win. The kind of winning mentality, always trying to do your best mentality, carries over into tiddlywinks, definitely. But I am pretty sort of steady away. And I think being an athlete and recognizing how you're triggered by other people helps me being a parent. In the morning when the kids haven't got themselves ready and nobody brushed their teeth and I've told them 55 times, recognizing how that's making me respond you know, physiologically how it's making me respond. You know, if you feel that stress response, you know that it starts to impact on how well you're thinking and also what you're going to say. And once you know that also that impacts on how well your children can then function.
Yeah.
Because if you're stressed, they become stressed and they can't do the things that they need to do. So it sort of transfers. Being in the boxing ring's like being a mother, isn't it? It's like being a parent. It's basically trying to control somebody.
Yeah. Well, that brings me beautifully into my next question, actually. So you talk about being able to take control of how you respond when somebody punches you. And can you explain how you develop such emotional control? And do you believe that anyone could train this?
Yeah, I think it comes from understanding like that physiology. So understanding that your emotion is basically just a conditioned response. You know, it's a sequence of neurological hormone, you know, it's neurochemical reactions that occur because you're conditioned to respond in a certain way. And once you know that, then you can start to identify what that response is to you. You know, are you somebody that starts to get tense when you're feeling emotional? Are you somebody who starts to hyperventilate? You know, what is that kind of physiological response? Because then you can shift it. And once you manage control, you know, that shift, then obviously the cascade is bi-directional. So once you've shifted your physical response, you shift what's happening at that sort of in that cognitive level. I think everybody can train that.
So I suppose in a way it's similar to what we try to do with the horses. If they're frightened of a plastic bag or something, you know, you're doing that, finding where their threshold is and then seeing if you can manipulate that.
Yeah.
You know, before you turn it into a fear response.
Yeah, definitely. But I also think, and I was thinking about this, you know, probably dealing with a horse is a little bit like dealing with an opponent, because I'm trying to shift their emotional response by changing what I'm doing with them. So if they're coming out and they're like, yeah, I'm going to kill her, then when we get to the ring and we're face to face, I'm not going to ramp up that energy, because that's the state they're trying to create to make themselves feel good. So I'll deliberately dampen down that, you know, I'll go hand on the shoulder, I'll talk really calmly to them, I'll smile at them, I'll really try and influence the way that their neurology is responding to me in that moment, so that I get control of kind of that emotional state, so that it's not the state they want to be in, it's the state that I want them to be in. And if they're quite low in mood, you know, if they're focused and concentrating, then I'll be completely the opposite, and I'll ramp up their central nervous system by talking fast to them or being twitchy or being in front of them, so that then it's me shifting their emotional reaction to the situation and not them being in control of it. And I suppose you could tweak that. You know, all animals are the same. You know, they all contain those mirror neurons that are connected to that emotional center of the brain. So I think it probably would work the same with a horse.
So come on then, neurophysio and master's psychology student. Tell us about mirror neurons.
Well, so, I mean, it's a fairly new area of research, isn't it? But what we think is that essentially, in the same way that your brain, the emotional centers of your brain are picking up your emotional reaction based on how your body is, so that the physical posture, the tone, the pitch, the energy of your body, we're also interpreting information from other people at a really subconscious level. And it's probably useful if we think about it almost prehistorically. It's probably useful in the sense that if we can pick up a subtle shift in somebody's physical state, a fear, a freeze response, if we can pick that up before the lion jumps through the door, then, you know, we're going to probably have an appropriate response as well. But it's a really subtle shift. And we see it if you look at people's breathing, even if you're in a room where somebody is not hyperventilation, so it's obvious, but has that chronic hyperventilation where the respiratory rate sits above what we'd want it to be for a healthy autonomic nervous system. You see that the people who are closely connected to them, as they're in the room for a prolonged period, start to increase their respiratory rate as well. And it's a really subtle shift, but actually what it's reflective of is that our autonomic nervous systems, that, you know, the system that controls whether in fight or flight or rest and digest, that system is basically trying to interpret the information of the people around us and prepare us for what it perceives to be in the environment, whether that's stress or calm.
So it's really interesting. I was listening to a podcast the other day about, we're going totally off piece now. I could see us in here for hours about the nervous system, and it was saying that. So obviously, I'm a musculoskeletal physio. That's my background. So I'm sort of familiar with chronic pain and how, as you know, your pain threshold lowers over time because the neural pathways and everything have got so good at playing the pain tune. So actually, where originally maybe picking up a heavy box might have triggered the back pain, now all you need to do is think about picking up the heavy box and it triggers the back pain. So in this podcast, it was saying that if your nervous system is really activated, you might look at somebody's face and it might be a completely innocuous face that they pull in, but because your threshold has moved, you suddenly perceive that as a threat, which is sort of what you're saying, because the nervous system's so activated. So here's an interesting thing. So obviously, I'm going to be positive in the self-talk that I use. I'm trying to reprogram my brain in the way that I'm dealing with the horses these days. But something such as them shaking their head when I'm doing something on the ground might trigger a catastrophic thought in my head. Like I might go, she's about to do this, she's about to leap on me and strike and da 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 da, just from this one innocuous thing. So how can I break that? How can I stop that from happening?
Yeah, and it does come from that sort of amygdala response, isn't it? It's conditioned to be almost that it's not a cognitive response. You know, it's not you processing all the head shaking. It's a conditioned response.
Yeah, and that's why it's so difficult to apply logic and go, you're fine, you know?
Yeah, but it's about, similar to what you do with a horse with a plastic bag. You know, it's about exposure. Yeah, so being exposed to that, but being aware of what's happening at that autonomic level. So, you know, really going in with dampening down your autonomic nervous system. So, you know, shifting yourself into that relaxed state. So spending time, you know, regulating your breath pattern, because you probably just going out towards the horse where that might happen, start to slightly increase that respiratory rate and start to slightly tense up. And it'll be a subtle change, but it's that threshold of change that triggers your arousal for danger. So your perception of danger might occur. So it's almost preempting that might happen and setting that, you know, low relaxed state, so that if you do get a trigger, we're not straight away driving into high arousal. But you know, so but it is partly about that exposure, and then if you can, cognitively rationalizing it, you know, that cognitive behavioral therapy almost of kind of reframing, rethinking, questioning the thought, oh, the horse is going to kick me. Is the horse really going to kick me? You know, what's the reality of this situation, which is hard to do, and is a process that I know you've been doing, it seems to me fairly well. But being aware of that's a trigger, and almost setting that intention before you go, so that we're, you know, lowering that state. Because if you're going tense, the horse is likely to be more spooked, aren't they? You know, they're going to pick up that energy and likely to be a little bit twitchier and a bit more responsive.
Yeah. And just while we're talking about this, I'm going to go on a couple of questions now. So horses are sensitive to energy, and in order to be a good horse person, you need to be able to bring your energy up and down. So we've talked about turning it down. Yeah. So and you talked about it with your opponent, like how you can ramp it up to throw them off. So I've sort of called those emotional transitions. I think I saw somebody put that, we called it that on Facebook somewhere, and I thought it was a good term. So do you think that is something that you can train, being able to literally turn the knob up and turn it down again?
Yeah, definitely, because you know, energy is created by what you're doing. So I'm sure you remember from your neurophysio days, we can turn up the activity of muscle through speed, through contact, through pace, but also through our pitch, our tone, our voice, that connection between speech and motor activity is really quite obvious. But your physical energy will have an impact on the animals around you, whether they're human or not. But by changing really simple things like that pitch, tone, speed of your movement and of your voice. So think about the energy level that you need for what you're going to do. And then you need to change your own state so that's it, the energy that you create. But it has an impact at that sort of, neurological level. We fire more neurons, we excite the central nervous system by speeding things up, by being louder, by using that tone, that creating energy by moving. It's really, it's not difficult. It's just understanding how you are, and understanding the state that you're in and where you want to be.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I think sometimes I think I've done it and then I watch back on the video and I'm actually still a bit like, oh, look, quite low in energy. But actually, if I could lead with something that's easier, like the voice,
Yeah.
or the speed of movement, then that might be a useful way to do it. So
yeah,
cool.
I think that the voice is quite an easy one to do, isn't it? Because you could sing a song and pick a tone, or get yourself into that state. Get a sea shanty. That seems to be all the thing at the moment, doesn't it? But if you think about even something like those sea shanties, the reason that people get connected to them is because the pitch and the pace of them is connected to the activity that's happening. So, that although they're nice, because a nice postman sings them now, but actually their purpose is to connect to a physical activity, to lift the energy of the fishermen. It's about changing somebody's, that kind of really primitive neurological state, changing somebody's energy level so they're able to do their job.
Yeah, that's what they're doing though. What do they call it in the SAS training, isn't it? Where they sing to each other to keep each other on their, what do they call that week they do where they get beasted on the beach? Anyway, digressing. So take us to a different part of your story then, or maybe it's something else, but can you tell us about a challenge that you faced and how you overcame it?
I think as an athlete, the biggest challenges are around injury, aren't they? Your identity is a little bit, or your purpose, your day, every bit of your structure is tied up to your training. And I've ruptured my cruciate a couple of times now. And the first one actually finished my Thaiboxing career. I wasn't able to kick after that. The consultant wasn't very happy about me kicking.
Can you tell us the story? It's a good story.
Well, the first one, I was in a gym in Leeds, and I was there to inspire some girls to take part in martial arts. That was my job for the day. I'd gone there to help this coach inspire the girls. And the girls were sort of challenging teenagers, 14-ish. And the coach decided that even though it was a girl's first lesson, it'd be a brilliant idea to teach them how to do jumping, spinning, roundhouse kicks. And she got one of the girls to hold the pad, so I go to do my jumping, spinning, roundhouse kick. And in that kick, you literally jump in the air and spin 360 and kick on your way round. But you do it by shifting your head first. So your head goes first, the rest of your body follows. Your foot's the last bit to come around. So I've spun, looked at the girl, and literally millisecond decision. She's not holding the pad near her head anymore. She's now having a chat with her mate who stood to her other side. And my decision is basically, do I knock her out or do I try and stop the kick? And clearly I tried to stop the kick. I didn't think it'd go down very well if I knocked her out. But I tried to stop the kick, and I landed it a bit funny in the hole in the mat. And I knew it was ruptured as soon as I stood up. I knew it was ruptured. The stability had completely gone. I kind of just had to stand there for the rest of the lesson, because obviously I didn't want the girl to feel traumatized by the fact that she'd ruined my career, basically. But it was a split second decision, and I think sometimes those challenges, it's things that are outside of our control, aren't they? I wasn't in control of the outcome of that situation. And I wasn't in control really of whether or not I could go back to Thai boxing. You know, that ended up not being my decision. But I was in control of what happened afterwards. You know, everybody's going to face a setback. Everybody's going to have these moments where it feels like all that you've worked for or everything that you're intending to do is taken away, or you haven't reached, you've set yourself that goal and you've not got there. But it really doesn't have to be that defining moment. Sometimes it does mean just a change of direction, you know, a reframe. And actually, it was probably the best thing that happened to me in a sporting sense, because it meant that I got to go and box for England, and I never would have done that had I still, yeah. but I wouldn't have done it if I could have still kicked. I'd have kept on kicking people, and I never would have had that whole experience of, you know, competing for your national team, being given your national shirt, you know, standing, singing the anthem, all that kind of stuff. I wouldn't have done that. And it had never been a goal that I'd set for myself. It had never been an ambition of mine particularly, until I'd had to reframe what I was working towards.
So how did you make the jump from like, oh my goodness, my career's ended, to like, oh, I'll go and box for England? Come on.
Yeah. Well, you know, I've said this before, and you've sort of heard me say this before. I was Thai boxing. I ended up as a Thai boxing champion completely by accident. You know, it really was an accident. I didn't have any special planning around it. I mean, obviously, I trained hard, but you know, I didn't sit down and write, one day I want to be a Thai boxing champion. But I did do that about boxing. You know, when I came out at the end of rehab, and you know, cruciate rehab's long and boring. But what had been great for me was that 2 months after my repair, I cycled the Tour de Mont Blanc with some kids that had already been in the diary, and I knew I had to do it. So I had to get fit pretty quickly, really. So I came out of the rehab actually quite strong. You know, we went away for a month. We cycled all these mountains. I did a lot of icing and stuff like that. But I came out of the rehab quite strong. And then just by chance, I suppose, sort of circumstance, a boxing club happened to open in Harrogate, where I'm based. So I went along, and I thought, well, you know, let's go to the championships. What's the worst that can happen? Yeah, and I suppose it's just opportunity, finding hard work. But I was very deliberate about the actions that I took, because I was 36 by the time I started boxing. That's old as an athlete to take a new sport.
Hadn't they just changed the age limit as well, meaning that you could do it? Literally,
that year they changed the age limit, so that they'd moved it from 35 had been the cutoff, and they'd moved it to 40. So it was almost destined, wasn't it? You know? But I had to be much more deliberate then. So all of the things that people talk about in terms of preparing for success, so, you know, just getting those basic habits right. You know, it's not about doing anything revolutionary. It's about taking care of yourself and doing the things that are going to make you a little bit better. You know, you don't have to do things that are crazy to be successful.
So I'm skipping on another couple of questions.
Because I ramble on.
No, it's fine. I could ramble on all night. So yeah, you said that you became a Thai boxer by accident and a boxer by design. So obviously, do you believe that we can all build success by design, and how do you go about doing that?
Yeah, I absolutely do. You know, and I don't like the, you know, anything is possible mantra, because sometimes there is a bit of luck involved. You know, I got to box for England because the girl who should have been boxing happened to injure herself, and I was at the time the next best person in the country. So, you know, there was a little bit of luck involved in that, but that luck was only fulfilled because I was prepared.
Because you were ready.
Yeah, I was prepared and I was ready. You know, it's never just an accident. There's all, you know, it's that 10-year overnight success thing, isn't it? It's never just an accident. But I also don't think that success is about this huge, big, you know, a problem that we create for ourselves, this outcome that we create for ourselves. It is just about lots of little things. It's just little things consistently that add up. You know, it's putting the miles in on the road. It's, you know, it's not anything that everybody can't do. Whether, it's on a horse or whether it's, in a boxing ring, or whether it's in a business, or whatever it is. It's just little things done consistently.
Yeah.
And people will get there at different times because they've got different elements of luck. But also it's about understanding what is it that your goal really is. Is your goal might be to win an Olympic medal. It might be, but it might really be about feeling proud of yourself, or feeling like you can walk away knowing that was the best you could have done. So
this leads me back beautifully. A few questions. How do you define success? Because I've started doing this sports psychology course myself for equestrian coaches. And one of the exercises that we had to do was to complete this timeline, doing our high points and our low points. And I got a bit down in the dumps because I thought all my high points were when I was younger, and there seems to be a bit of a barren patch from when I had the children. And one of the examples that popped into my head was I've run 2 marathons when I was younger. And then last January, before all the COVID thing kicked off, I hadn't run since I had the kids because of various labour traumas and all the rest of it. I hadn't run for 7 years. And I ran the park run in January last year, and I ran all the way around, which was just 5K. So I actually felt like totally amazing. Oh, wow, I've done the park run. I'm back running again. Like, it was a massive big deal. But when I was doing like my timeline, that didn't feel like a success because that was 5K versus a marathon. So it really raised these questions with me, like, how do you define success? And I suppose you could say, like, obviously when I was younger, I was rode at a couple of home internationals, and now I'm not riding. So that definition of success and identity can have quite a big impact. So, bit of a ramble there. How do you define success, and what would you say to somebody in a similar situation?
Well, I'd redefine that timeline without the highs and the lows, because actually that whole journey, that winding path of a journey is about a constant lesson, isn't it? It's not that success. I might be standing there with the belt around my waist or the gold medal around my waist, but in that moment, that might not define success, because I might have got there in a way that, wasn't healthy, or that didn't make me feel good about myself. How many people do we see who outwardly appear to have huge success, but actually from that emotional perspective still don't find peace with that? But for me, success is much simpler than that. It's about always being able to finish the day having felt like it was a good day, and that might be different each day. That might be as simple as I've managed to do the washing today.
Yes.
It doesn't have to be something that's enormous, but it's about always, I think, finding purpose more than finding success. So the purpose of that park run, that made you feel healthier, that's made you feel happier, that's been the first time that you've been able to run, but it's also inspired your children to see you to
Yes.
go out and do it. Maybe it's not about looking at how we outwardly conform to what society perceives success to be, and looking more towards, what is it that my purpose is in this moment. Even boxing for England for me wasn't really, I mean, it's an amazing experience you've done it yourself, it's an amazing experience.
I have never
well, not boxing, but getting that national shirt, there's still time, Lou. You're younger than me. There's still time.
Sometimes I feel like it when Stu's annoying me.
But it's about that purpose, and I felt like if I could go and redefine myself in a different way, then my children would watch that. So it didn't really matter actually to me whether or not I managed to get the shirt. And I did write it down. That was the first time I'd ever written a goal down. I wrote down the goal of I want to box for England. It was the first time I'd ever committed a sporting goal to paper, but I committed it to paper so that my children could see that was what I was working towards, because it was more about that purpose of being able to inspire them, to be able to help them to see that hard work might take you somewhere, but it also might not, and that's all right. It's all right so long as you're working towards something that makes you feel good.
leads me again beautifully into my next question, which is how do you balance being a mum with your sport, and did becoming a mum challenge your identity? Because I know you had a very dramatic going into labour. I
Yeah.
remember.
Yeah, I like to be dramatic. But yeah, well, it wasn't that dramatic for me. It was dramatic for everybody else. I just kind of fell over and sort of died a little bit. People just cut them out, didn't they? It wasn't dramatic for, for me. I don't remember any of it. I think it redefined how I felt about, I suppose, what I was trying to achieve in terms of my sport. So it definitely moved from being about, always hitting the PB on the numbers, trying to, because it makes you feel good. If you lift a bit more weight, you feel good about yourself. It shifted more towards that, being able to show the consistency and the hard work. So my kids have always come to the gym with me from being really little. They've always sat, even in car seats, they'd sit at the side of the ring, and they've always been in the weights gym, and they've always been part of that. So now that physical activity piece is normal for them. That's what people do. Everybody exercises, mums exercise, and your mum can be as strong as your dad. That's the other thing that or stronger than your dad in our household. But that's the other thing that it, because of the sport that it is, it's removed for them that perception that there's a barrier because of who they are, whether that because they're a boy or a girl. The barrier, that gender barrier, and the barrier across most elements of life has been removed for them, because we live in a very gender different household. My husband does the household jobs and I go punch people. It's a very different balance to what would be perceived to be the norm. But there is definitely, goes back again to that asking for help. I couldn't have continued to compete as an international athlete without being able to say to people, can you help me? And that was a bit to my coaches, I need some leeway here in terms of when I can train. I couldn't always go and train at the camps that people wanted me to go at. But equally, it relied on my family being able to step in and, to pick up some of that practical burden.
Yeah. And then there's the mummy guilt and feeling selfish. Did you suffer from that, or were you able to frame it in the way that you said that I'm actually inspiring my children?
Yeah, I think I framed it like that, and I think that as an athlete, you are inherently selfish. It's an inherently selfish act, because you are, you need to go to bed early. You don't go out with your friends. You miss events. It is an inherently selfish way of living, but not in a way that is deliberately hurtful. So I suppose if you don't have people around you that understand that it's not deliberately hurtful, then it might become a bit of a challenge. But if you can take everybody that's important on that journey with you, so that they buy into it and it becomes part of their journey as well, then you lose that sort of tie to guilt. We shouldn't feel guilty about aspiring to feel good about ourselves, but also aspiring to be our best. We want that for our children, and they mirror what they see. They mirror what they see, don't they?
And we want that for our friends, don't we? We want it's so much easier to be objective and want that for other people than it is for yourself. So how do you believe in yourself, and how do you inspire others to believe in themselves?
I think you learn that belief, don't you? And you learn that belief a little bit from failing, and then being strong enough to come back. And that might be because you've got support to do that, when you lose and somebody puts their arm around you and walks you back to the changing room. It's about that metaphorically being picked up when you've been knocked down. But it's a learned process, and it goes back to all of those things that we've already talked about. So understanding that belief is just another emotion. It goes back to that fear or that anxiety or that worry. If we're not believing in ourselves, and the underlying emotion around that is one of those things. but it's recognizing where that emotion comes from. What is it that we're afraid of? Is it that we're afraid that we're not good enough, that we're going to fail, that people are going to judge us? What is it that we're afraid of? And then challenging that fear. And once you've understood that fear is not reality, it's just your thought, then actually it's much easier to move to a place where you believe in yourself.
And how do you inspire others to believe in themselves? Because I know you do a lot of work with the Youth Sport Trust. And I think you were going around a lot of schools prior to all this pandemic business.
Yeah, it's slightly more challenging on Zoom when you don't know if the kids are just playing Xbox in the background. But I think it connects. People are connected to story. You're inspiring when you share your story. When we share our stories with people, so that young people particularly understand that this is not just a linear path. That those peaks and troughs that your psychology course is trying to get you to do actually are just bends in the road, aren't they? If you turned it around and laid it the other way, actually it's just a wavy path. And having a story that it shares that wavy path is all right, and that it's all right to not feel great when you start looking down the road, that it's all right to sometimes steer off the path and then find your way back again. I think that connecting through story, because that's the way our brains are designed. We're designed to connect through story. It really helps, particularly young people, to feel motivated to take a risk, to be brave enough to take a risk.
And what do you say to young people that, because I have this a bit with my eldest daughter, that when they start to find things difficult, they want to chuck in the towel rather than, when I was running, when I got to the bottom of a steep hill, I'd be like, and like dig in. And, I loved a big hill to climb. What do you say to those children, those young people, or anybody that feels that way when things get tough?
It's conditioning ourselves to be resilient, isn't it? It's a little bit like holding your child's hand as they're walking along, a narrow wall, and then letting them go for little bits, but still being there. It's that kind of handhold into feeling that challenge. Moving that sphere of comfort, because you're, I suppose, going with them a little bit. And for the young people that I'm working with, I'm often talking about the team that they're building around them, so going back to that very first part of this conversation around who can you go and ask for help, who can you be brave enough to go and ask to hold your hand, so that you can find a little bit more resilience, because it does feel easier if you've got someone that's supporting you, doesn't it? So it's almost that going with them a little bit, and then exposing them to the plastic bag. It's it's exactly the same for a child as a horse. It's developing that confidence to be afraid and to recognize that disaster isn't going to happen. But also, I definitely feel like there's a place for physical activity here for young people. Letting your kids go climb a tree, letting them take risks from a physical perspective, particularly for girls, letting them go and play rugby and rough sports where they're being bashed about a little bit, and they're having to manage that conflict. They're managing the conflict with people around them, but it means they're having to manage conflict for themselves.
Brilliant. Right, we've got another question from the bath. Hang on. Is there anything that you've decided is unachievable for you? And if not, is that purely because of the mental conditioning you've done?
I've decided some things aren't my priority. So I don't think I've ever thought to myself that's not achievable for me. But I think I've definitely thought. So when I re-ruptured my cruciate, I'd boxed for England, I'd got myself back fit again, and I got in the ring, and I just didn't feel the same passion. And I think that was partly because I wish I'd never written that goal down, because I'd already written the goal down, and the thing I'd written down I'd already achieved. So that long road to rehab just didn't feel like a priority anymore. I felt like I could have a bigger impact if I directed my energy somewhere else. So I don't know that it's about not thinking things are achievable. I think maybe where people might have expected me to go and pursue a goal, or try and continue, to get to the Olympics or whatever, it at the time just didn't feel like it was an important priority for me. Like I didn't want to commit my energy to that. You know, energy is a resource, and I didn't want to commit my energy to it.
So what's the biggest thing that you've learned through sport, and how can others learn from that and apply it?
I definitely think that removing that fear is the thing, and probably most importantly, that fear of being judged. You know, that underlying fear of society judging me, or you know, that other people's opinion is more important than the way that I feel about myself. I think that that's probably the greatest gift sport's given me. You know, now I genuinely really don't mind what people's opinions are of me. Some people will hate me, and some people will like me, and that's fine. That's absolutely fine for me, because you know, once you've been punched and laid down on a canvas, actually you understand that pain is just a temporary factor. You know, whether it's emotional pain or physical pain is temporary, and it's changeable. You know, so I suppose removing the fear of being fearful probably is the greatest gift sport's given me.
Brilliant. And finally then, what are your goals for 2021, whatever that is going to look like? It's not looking so is it?
Well, it's not to go on holiday, is it?
No.
Not go anywhere exciting. I think that you know, when I transitioned out of sport over the last year or two, definitely having more time to try and really frame those things that I've learned through sport, so that they're shareable to other people. You know, particularly around that neuropsychology. I think that for me is the biggest difference for a person in terms of being comfortable and happy with their life, and being able to achieve the things that they want to do, is being able to take control of your own emotional well-being, and being resilient around some of that kind of emotional conflict or emotional challenge. So I'm hoping that I'll pass my dissertation, and then I'll be done with that psychology, and maybe I'll do a PhD. That might be my next challenge, a PhD, looking at some sort of brain science, and how, you know, how we can make this all evidence-based for people, so that it's not just lots of mumbo jumbo that people bring together on the internet and, you know,
I used to think I had a PhD in me, but now I think it's a miracle if I wash my hair. Oh dear, I don't know. Brilliant. If people want to find out more about you, how can they do that?
Just connect with me. I think you tagged me on your Facebook or your Instagram, didn't you? So just connect with me. If you've got any questions, you can get in touch. That's all good. You'll find me on most social media. I don't post very often, but you'll find me there occasionally.
and work athlete that you do, is that a coaching program? Is that for businesses that's aimed at?
Yeah, so work athlete is working in business. So very similar to the kind of work that I've been doing with young people, but much more targeted one-to-one coaching support. So particularly looking at some of those lifestyle behaviours that have an impact on your performance, but also, I think more importantly for me, how you're responding and how resilient you are to stress of life. And it's so much more important today than it's ever been. You know, when the world's uncertain and our brain doesn't have a clue what's going on in the outside world, we've got to take control of our internal world. And if we allow that chaos to drive, you know, our physiology, then actually we start to shift the structure and nature of our brain, and we need to make sure that doesn't happen, because ultimately that's where we, you know, start to struggle with mental health problems.
Well, it's been awesome talking to you. We should do it far more often. Yeah. Life and babies and work.
Hopefully all your listeners didn't disconnect at 20 minutes when I ramble on.
Brilliant. Well, you take care, and thank you so much for joining us. It's been an honour. See you later.
Yeah, we'll see you soon, hopefully.
Bye. Bye.